been a while since we looked at Crappy Angel sequel number 1, so the time feels right to look at Crappy Angel sequel number 2, which is important because it did what the first Crappy Angel sequel did not. Actually managed to kill off the Angels as a recurring villain, which is pretty impressive given this was only their third appearance. Indeed, aside from their brief and ill-fated cameo in Class, it would be nearly a decade until they were back in the show, and they've hardly been a mainstay of the show's internal culture since this point. Now, admittedly, to blame all of that on this one episode is probably not correct. It's not a good episode, in fact it's quite a shit one, but I think Angel fatigue had set in long before this point, and watching this episode would have simply confirmed to anyone that there was going to be no reversing it. This is a pretty bad episode, and while there's nothing so egregious that would really drop it into the depths, it's just a bit shit. There's also not really much to recommend it for either, which means that apart from its recurring villain and companion departure, I don't think it would be all that noteworthy because there's nothing holding it up. It relies on cliches and established ideas for the most part, even reliable performers like Matt Smith and Alex Kingston clearly think little of the script and are hardly at their A-game, and in the occasions it is notable, it's only because of how stupid it is. A few bright spots on the production side and that's about it. Frankly, it's among the least notable episodes I've done for this channel, aside from, as I said, its recurring villain and the departure of notable companions. It does, however, make for an interesting topic of conversation because for me it is basically the perfect quintessential example of everything that's wrong with New Who. Terrible pacing, stupid ill-thought-out ideas, style over substance, weak characterization, pathetic melodrama, bad dialogue. It's basically all that makes up this episode, and that to me represents New Who's worst and most annoying habits. And while it's fitting it's an episode where Stephen Moffat no doubt had to be surgically extracted from the inside of his own arse that represents this. It's for this reason alone that the episode truly annoys me, as it's the kind of bad New Who that shows how uninterested anyone running the show has ever been in learning and changing. Of course, we're looking at this because of the Angels themselves, and as I said at the start, fatigue had set in by this point, and everyone was just going, oh, not them again. Which was pretty impressive given, again, this was only their third time on screen. The fall of the Angels was a monument perhaps to the fatigue everyone was feeling with the Moffat era itself in a way, but also because, all the other reasons this episode is crap, so let's get on to those. We'll start by looking at production, as that's where what we usually do, and I see no reason to change it now. This is where most, if not all, the episode's positives can be discussed. The episode was directed by Nick Hurran. Hurran? I'll go with Hurran. Who did a few episodes around this time, and then managed to land the director's chair for The Day of the Doctor, which was a hell of a coup considering he only actually done a few episodes. I have to say though, I would not be surprised if this was the episode that got him that job, as his directing is the episode's saving grace, and the only thing I'm going to have anything positive in particular to say about. There are two reasons I think he deserves credit here. Firstly, a major problem with this episode's portrayal of the Angels I'll get into a bit is how derivative it feels. It's just, oh look, Angels stalking people and looking like innocuous statues and creeping up stuff that was honestly old before the end credits rolled on Blink, and this easily could have just become dire and repetitive. So I give huge credit to Hurran in doing his best to avoid that. It's not 100% successful simply because what's on the page prevents it from being so, but he chooses from unique camera angles, atmospheric lighting choices, and editing decisions that results in part of it feeling genuinely quite tense, even as the audience is rolling their eyes into the back of their sockets at this shit being pulled off yet again. The second thing is that he does a great job with just giving the piece a well-flowing and cinematic feel. He milks the New York location for all it's worth, giving us some wonderful shots that make great use of the space and lighting, while keeping the inside shooting tight and focused, and making sure the tension and claustrophobia, when it's needed, really comes across. Sometimes the script is just setting up to fail, and there's no way on earth that giant Statue of Liberty was going to look anything other than ridiculous. And the Rory chased by giggling child angels in the dark scene is a pretty similar story. But he more than makes up for those times with his top atmosphere and a great cinematic feel. It's a really good job overall, and the few instances where it doesn't work is entirely the fault of the script and not him. It is the saving grace of this otherwise crap episode that at least makes the inane stuff on the page somewhat watchable. The rest of the production is okay. The production design's decent, the studio scenes definitely don't give off the "this was filmed in Cardiff" vibe they so often can, which is a testament to getting to fit in with the New York aesthetic. The music is okay too, bar getting too melodramatic towards the end, but then that fits the episode itself, does it not? So Mr. Gold gets a pass here as well. Other than that, not really much to talk about. That unfortunately leaves me no other option than to talk about the script, so I'll start by one of its most obvious aspects, that the thematic styling of this episode clearly is trying to go for is the hard-boiled detective film noir stuff, which I think, to use a phrase coined by Sir Humphrey Appleby, was a courageous choice. This, in my view at least, is a very difficult line to walk in pulling it off without being ridiculously over the top, or falling into unintentional parody. The truth is, it's a bit of a punchline of a genre, easy to mock as a staple of amateur writing, in the "it was a dark and stormy night and I was loading my six-shooter when a dame walked in, blah blah blah," that kind of thing. And well, the fact that Bill Waterson so effortlessly parodied it with the tracer bullet bits in Calvin and Hobbes was a sign of how easy a punchline it was even 35 years ago. To be able to lean into it properly, especially when it's clearly a one-off genre shift like it would have to be for Doctor Who to do it, you'd have to have a writer who had a very strong grasp of the after's subtlety and excelled at making sure their scripts were focused. And you know where I'm going with this, that doesn't really sound like Stephen Moffat to me, does it? Someone who thinks subtlety is something NASA astronauts drink. Have a think about it, subtle sounds like shuttle tea, yeah. Not one of my finest. Anyway, it shouldn't come as any real surprise to you that this episode starts on a dark and stormy night with a hard-boiled detective being given a case by some shady character, and, well, that sort of sets the tone for how this theming plays out, as the usual tropes combined with the usual Moffatisms make it slightly insufferable, I think it's fair to say. Now, I get it. The way the book is presented in the story's narrative and the way it plays out, it's meant to be a parody of sorts, but I have a few problems with this, mostly that I'm not sure what this particular parody is meant to be an aid of. It's not as if the show has a long association with this genre, and it's not as if it's using the pulp novel type thing as a way of telling that kind of story. It's telling a very Doctor Who story within those confines, so what's the point? I'm not the kind of person who thinks that absolutely everything must have a set-in-stone narrative purpose. Sometimes stylistic or thematic choices are fine, but this is in aid of nothing. There's the opening, which is frankly more about the angel jump scare stuff than the actual film noir stuff the setup implied. And then other than the setting and the stuff with the book, the story isn't really about any of that in any way. I feel like it's just a distraction when one is very much not needed, as the episode is already packed with angel stuff and Amy and Rory stuff. An actual Doctor Who take on this genre probably needed to commit to it fully, and this was very much not the episode to do it. The weakness of the plot does not help this, of course, adding to the feeling this setting is just a bizarre waste of time that is in the order of something quite so weak. This ranges from logical holes. If the people trapped in the apartment building are attacked by the angels whenever they try to leave, how do they get food? Who comes and cleans the rooms? Who does the plumbing? To completely unexplained stuff, mostly to do with the ending that we'll get to underdeveloped characters. For instance, there's a villain who has a Mikhail Gorbachev birthmark on his face. What do we know about him? That he likes to collect things and that he's a moron, and that's about it. His character or motivations go nowhere and connect into nothing. Too inane and weak technobabble replacing actual plotting. The thingamajig time what's it means we have to go to China for about 10 seconds for reasons so we can MacGuffin the what's it. This means the whole thing just feels very disjointed and unfocused, like we skip from idea to idea without really going through any of them, because it never bothers focusing on the answers to any questions. This also brings in another major issue of the episode, which is pacing, because Jesus fucking Christ on a pogo stick is this episode not an absolute poster child for why the New Who episode format can strangle stories as effectively as it does. Yeah, I know, I'm really boring about this, and I'm not going to repeat myself once again, but this episode absolutely does not work as a single 45-minute episode, and in order to have even remotely effectively explored its ideas, I think it needed to be a two-parter. This is so rushed through. The idea of this Chinese vase being something for the TARDIS to focus on feels far more like lazy convenience technobabble than it necessarily needed to, because all it takes place in the sphere is about a minute at most. It begs the question of why this diversion was even necessary in the first place, and why its resolution feels quite so cheap and lazy. This is also obvious when we see the pace at which events happen through the episode. The most obvious one is the great reveal of Rory being trapped in the apartment building and seeing his older self die, which should clearly be a huge reveal which massively influences events in our characters and takes place maybe, 10 minutes from the end of the episode? And as most of that has to be given up to the final departure of the two companions, it basically only gets one conversation worth of consideration before that's all wrapped up nicely. And yet, conversely, we had several minutes worth of teaser to waste on angel jump scares, which shows that while the format is the root of the problem, misusing it doesn't really help. This weak plot combined with the poor pacing makes for a confused, unfocused and rushed story, with little idea of what it truly wants to be about as it rushes from plot point to plot point. It feels like a series of connected events and not a coherent story. This is further enhanced by the ideas of the story. Some are actually not bad, although some of them very much are, the Statue of Liberty Angel, but some of them aren't bad. The idea of using time as the main driver of the story, I like that. It's a very Doctor Who approach, and uses the show's unique selling point. In particular, the idea of the book giving them forewarning of what's happening is very interesting. It really gives a chance to explore something only speculative fiction can do. How would you act if you knew what the future holds? It's a neat idea and one that could have played in some of the earliest ideas around time travel the show ever pulled off. It's not quite the same thing, but in the Aztecs, Barbara having forewarning of what would happen to them if they continued down their path was what motivated her futile attempt to change it, because she felt that was right. Similarly, the Doctor here could have forewarning of what was coming and having to second guess every action he was taking because he so badly wanted to avoid that outcome. Well, that's not what we get. We get it used for the occasional cheap moment where the dum-dum-dum is only literally missing from the soundtrack, and otherwise get nonsense like if it's written down but it's going to happen, which feels like that's very much against more or less the entire show's history of portraying time travel, where changing history is very much possible. I'm pretty sure Pete Tyler has died, or the world hasn't been destroyed by Sutekh, were written down in one way or another, and yet those histories were still changed. Hell, we saw something written down change in front of our very eyes only a few years before this story, when Adelaide shot herself at the end of the Waters of Mars. So this is a bullshit premise that completely negates the potential dramatic impact of having this as an idea at all. The book is telling us that it is predicting what's happening, and then that happens. Terrific. A really intriguing setup is completely wasted because they had nothing done with it. Other ideas are misused too. The idea of the angels as collector's items is potentially interesting, but is given almost nothing until the villain basically disappears from the episode, and it feels like a distraction. Or exploring the Doctor and River's relationship further. Admittedly, they spent a lot of time doing it up to that point, particularly in the previous series, but there are still interesting things to be said at any point, and they serve us a bit here. Such as his care for her clearly overriding his better judgment and causing him to do stupid stuff like give her regeneration energy for a minor ailment like a broken wrist. Regeneration energy Moffat would later retcon away that means he shouldn't have had here in the first place, but never mind. Oh, and quickly, since they are two characters aren't really going to come up again, Matt Smith and Alex Kingston, usually very reliable performers. Matt Smith is usually the best thing about bad 11th Doctor episodes. They are clearly checked out here, and who can blame them? This is not up to their usual standards at all. Anyway, I just needed to say that because, again, those characters aren't going to probably come up again. Anyway, this is stuff that... This overall is stuff that might have had an interesting side plots in a two-parter, but without the time to dedicate it, it's just to exploring it, it's just a waste of time, and has given the tiniest amount of surface exploration. It, of course, wouldn't be a Moffat episode without the Moffatisms we all know and loathe, or at the very least I do. The dialogue is laughably poor and unnatural, ranging from the infuriatingly annoying quirkiness we get at the start, where three people talk as absolutely no group of friends ever do, to ridiculous over-the-top speech like the one River gives to Amy about the Doctor. Never let him see you age. What the fuck are you talking about? Just because something sounds profound in your head, Moffat, doesn't mean it actually is. Then there's a spectacle over substance approach, another frequent new who wheeze of course, and one that I complain about at my leisure, but here it's particularly bad. The most obvious representation of this is the Statue of Liberty being a weeping angel, a development that makes so little sense it sort of baffles me. Firstly, the Statue of Liberty is made of copper, not stone, and the angels are very clearly described as previously being described as made of stone, so even by the already pretty warped logic we are working with, that apparently that any statue can be an angel, this is a very stupid idea, but I can't blame this episode for that because it was established in Blink, this still makes no fucking sense. Secondly, angels need not to be observed to move. That was broken in the last two-parter, but in theory they needed to not be observed to move, and given there's probably someone always looking at the Statue of Liberty because it's such a famous landmark at any point, how does it ever move? Thirdly, how does nobody ever notice the statue having suddenly moved from its perch over to this random apartment building? I know it was the Great Depression and all that, but were people so fucking miserable that they didn't notice the world's famous landmark going for a stroll? And fourthly, what effect does it have? The angels need to touch someone to do anything for them, and I can't quite get the ridiculous image out of my head of the massive angel reaching its hand up and booping the person on the top of their head. I can't believe they didn't show that on screen, and it wouldn't look stupid at all. And also, why would the angels even need a huge one like that? They're already a bit of an evolutionary head-scratcher, but massive for the sake of it seems pointless. But that rather sums it up, doesn't it? What's the bloody point? Why is it here? It has nothing to the story other than attempting to be a cool visual, and that fails because of how absurd it looks and how nonsensical the idea is. It honestly becomes kind of funny how we have an emotional moment with Amy and Rory and this fucking thing is in the background staring down looking ridiculous. It's typical New Who, and particularly Moffat writing. Add the idea to look cool in first without thinking about how it affects the story later. Anyway, for an episode based on two main things, companion departure and angels, and I haven't talked much about Arvis so far, so let's change that. Firstly, Amy and Rory. Now, I won't talk much about their overall characters, because I still have most of Series 5 and all of Series 6 to cover, and that's a much more natural place to talk about them and their arcs. Particularly, to be frank, their actual character arcs ended in Series 6, and they felt like they were going through emotions with them in bit in Series 7. Notice how the series opened with them not in love anymore, then back in love, and it's basically as if that never happened for the rest of the series. So overall, this was probably a good time for them to leave, and the episode is focused on that departure. The problem is, though, it just doesn't feel like this is about them in any way. I mean, they're important to it. Rory gets taken by the angels, and Amy's upset by this, as you'd expect her to be. And eventually the devotion to each other keeps them together despite the angels, but these are just events, things that happen. You can bullet point every beat as they go through, and not a single one actually tells us anything about them as characters, or why they act and feel the way they do. I mean, yeah, they love each other, but we kind of figured that given they were married. There's no deeper exploration of it, just going through each expected beat under the circumstances. Even their big conversation, I call it that, it's just a Moffat speech done by two people instead of one this time, but you get the idea. It's just, I love you too, let's jump off this building because we love each other so much. It tells us nothing about how they really feel. How they might feel about the danger, any regrets or deeper fears it's brought up, how they face the enormity of the situation they're facing, there's just none of it. This is partially again a product of the pacing issues. How on earth can there be enough time to properly explore this when they only find out about Rory's potential forever imprisonment 10 fucking minutes from the end of the episode? When the final choice comes and Amy lets herself be taken by the angel, it doesn't feel like there's any weight to it, because frankly it's coming down to wife decides to stay with husband she loves, and the approach taken, that this isn't anywhere a choice for her, is frankly bizarre and maybe shows they never quite worked out Amy's priorities after, all that flirting with the Doctor earlier on in her time in the series. Of course, this is the usual New Who deaf but not actual deaf companion departure, which makes it 3 out of 4 up to this point in New Who's run, and they'd reach a 5th before breaking the streak, and at this point it had already become an irritating trope. All the events of this episode bend and writhe their way through the idiocy and the technobabble to lead to this extremely contrived point, where because of the time Watsits we have this extremely specific circumstance where Amy has to do this to result in this outcome. This fails in 3 ways. Firstly, because the emotional beats it reaches just don't work, as I said. The Doctor is absolutely devastated because Amy gets to live out the rest of her life happily with the man she loves. I mean, I get he's losing a friend, but it feels very absurdly over the top given the circumstances, and gives off the impression that she should care more about him than she does Rory, which is kind of insane to be frank, and again reaches back to those early times when they hadn't really worked out her priorities at all. Secondly, it makes no fucking sense. It's often mentioned that Amy and Rory could simply hop on a ship across the Atlantic and meet up with the Doctor there. The TARDIS wiki even says that Matt Smith expressed this at this, but obviously it's on the TARDIS wiki, so I'll take it with a pinch of salt. But frankly, given the Doctor specifies New York would be destroyed if he lands there, what stops him from taking a ferry across to New Jersey and meeting there? What's the boundary of this destroy the universe if I land there area? But also, so little of it is actually explained or developed, it leaves far more questions than that. For instance, are they stuck in that apartment building forever, or do they just live normally in New York? The latter, I think, is the insinuation, but we never get any confirmation of that. But importantly, because it's based entirely on stupid technobabble, we never get an idea of why this is happening. They can never see each other again because, shut up, that's about the length of it. Thirdly, and finally, it feels like such a cheap cop-out to avoid killing them. Again, because of how contrived it is. All these specific time Watsits means that I can't see you again. It feels so cheap and lazy. Like we're being pigeonholed into a specific emotional reaction, and that never works. It happened before with Rose and Donna, and it would happen again with Clara and Bill. It's just such a writer's cop-out, avoiding actually having the balls to kill off a character you've grown attached to, but still wanting a departure with that emotion, which is annoying because it misses the possibilities where other situations hold. Let's compare 2 of the 5th Doctor's companion departures. Adric, who dies, and Tegan, who doesn't. Both very emotional departures that work well. One because it truly commits to that shocking death and the result of it, and the other because it's about the relationship between the Doctor and companion. Tegan isn't being separated because forever in an almost death, but it's been forced on us. It's coming about because she's choosing to leave, and the character interactions and character relationships are what drives it. This has just as much emotional potential, but then Moffat wouldn't be able to have his cake and eat it too, and we can't have that, can we? What's more is that how contrived and forced this means that it feels even more like cheap melodrama. It was already pushing out with the over-the-top jumping off the building scene and the over-the-top bit of music that went with it, but this is really what puts the cherry on the top of that particular cake. But here's the thing, I think you could have your cake and eat it too here. With some minutes to the rest of the episode, cutting down the unnecessary teaser to make the room, and you could make a bit more room and cutting out the final bits of removing the last page because it would be unnecessary as a result of this, as you'll soon see, and then changing up the technobabble a bit to suit it, I think you could have these beats. The ending can play out as it does up until Amy is taken, when the Doctor suddenly realises, wait, hang on, he can lock onto a MacGuffin like he did with the China stuff earlier. You'd need to put a Chekhov's gun earlier in the episode to make it work, but that wouldn't be too hard. And then he does take the TARDIS back into past New York, but because of the time instability or whatever, he misses a bit, ends up a few years too late, and finds that Amy and Rory, without the Doctor, have settled down. They have a home and made a life for themselves. Rory works at a hospital, Amy does whatever she does. I didn't think there'd be much need for kissograms or whatever she was in 30s New York, but you get the idea. Perhaps they've even adopted some kids. They've moved on, And that makes it all the more heartbreaking for the Doctor because he realises he is going to have to move on whether he wants to or not, especially because he got that brief moment of false hope. This, I think, is a small change that would make the whole episode much more effective. An emotional payoff based not on contrived stories, but choices and motivations. We can clearly see that Amy chooses Rory, and we clearly see that she regretted it not for a moment, and that concludes their character arcs. But we don't get that, and the final moment is weak. Finally, the angels themselves. As I said earlier, this feels like it's falling back on old habits that had got very old. The stalking angels looking creepy stuff. Yeah, it's just old hat. Even with Hurran doing its best, it feels like a lazy retread of Blink. I get doing something new with them had failed last time, but falling back on this just feels like it's further reinforcing that they should have just left well enough alone to begin with. And yet there's so many instances of their power that came through that creepiness and Brink being diminished. The stupid cackling children ones makes no fucking sense. The Statue of Liberty one, as I said at length. The fact that one touched River didn't transport her but instead broke her wrist because the plot demanded it. Yet, unlike in the first sequel where it felt like it was genuine ideas but stupid ones, here it just feels like lazy contrivances and pulling whatever they want out of their asses. A lot of it once again comes down to the failure to develop ideas. The angels setting up this kind of prison to easily feast seems like the kind of idea that should be genius, showing how their thinking works and evolves, and perhaps even gives us further insights into what they are, but because the time is so limited, the idea is just given lip service. It's explained what's going on, but not why and what it means. I'll concede that they feel more consistent with the more successful elements of Blink here. The mystique that the previous Angel sequel destroyed does feel like it's back at least back entirely on the surface level, but the problem is, for anything deeper than that, you can't put the rabbit back in the hat. The Angels were already a pale shadow of their original selves through fatigue or from overexposure, I think, as much of the stories themselves. And to fall back on those original things, it just ends up feeling derivative, as I said. The lack of time doesn't help, and they feel like background villains to a plot but doesn't really revolve around them, and that's unfortunate given this was only their third appearance and that style was quickly waning, as I said, but I think it contributed to the feeling that came out of this, and ultimately the reason they disappeared for the show as long as they did. The Angels just feel irrelevant after this. There's nothing new to tell about them, just rehashing the greatest hits, and if you're not going to try and do anything interesting, why bother at all? In a way, they feel a bit like a metaphor for the Moffat era as a whole. If you're not going to learn and change, what's the bloody point? And that's a question I myself have never quite answered. This episode is a perfect encapsulation of the worst imbeciles of the Moffat era. Cheap melodrama, bad dialogue, spectacle over substance, poor pacing, ill thought out plots and ideas, and a determination to have his cake and eat it too. It's hardly the worst thing he ever did, and it's far stupider and less intelligent, far more melodramatic, and there's nothing insulting about it or anything like that. It's bad, it's just merely bad, and combined with the positive effects of Hurran's direction, elevates it above the artist's lackey, but make no mistake, it's a bad episode. You know what, I'll just cut to the chase and tell you, I'm giving it a score of 3 out of 10. Bad, but not the absolute worst. Hurran's direction is solid, and that's about it. The elements I mentioned just combine together for a thoroughly unimpressive outing. For me, it's a sign of how deeply frustrating New Who can be, where a few good ideas are just not used effectively, and mixed in with the same old mistakes over and over again. The opportunities and potential in episodes like this frustrate me because of how effective the return of old villains and departures of companions can be, but in this instance very much not.